Everyone in that room thought I'd lost my mind. My mother was crying in the gallery. My best friend looked at me like I'd betrayed myself. I'll never forget the look on my husband's face when he realized what he'd actually taken from me in the divorce. He sat there in that courtroom, smirking like he'd won the lottery, holding papers that gave him the house, the cars, the business, the bank accounts, everything except our son. His lawyer had this satisfied grin plastered across his face. My own lawyer was practically in tears beside me, begging me one last time to reconsider. "Sarah, please, you can't do this," she whispered. But I just smiled, picked up that pen, and signed my name on every single line. But what none of them knew, what he especially didn't know, was that 3 months earlier, I'd discovered something that would turn his victory into the biggest mistake of his miserable life. And as I watched him shake his lawyer's hand that day, I thought to myself, enjoy it while it lasts, Richard. Enjoy it while it lasts. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and this is the story of how I lost everything in my divorce, or at least how everyone thought I did. Let me take you back to the beginning. Richard and I met 15 years ago at a corporate fundraiser in Chicago. I was 26, working as a junior architect at a mid-sized firm, and he was this charming, ambitious real estate developer who made me laugh within the first 5 minutes of conversation. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. Looking back now, I realize that should have been my first red flag. People who are that good at making you feel special usually have a lot of practice. But I was young and in love, or at least what I thought was love. We got married 2 years later in this beautiful ceremony overlooking Lake Michigan. I wore my grandmother's veil. Richard cried during his vows. It all felt so perfect, like a movie. The first few years were good. Really good, actually. Richard's business was growing, and I was climbing the ladder at my firm. We bought our first house in Evanston, a gorgeous Victorian that needed work, but I could see its potential. I spent months renovating it, pouring my heart into every design decision. That house became my masterpiece. Then I got pregnant with our son, Dylan. That's when things started to shift. Richard wanted me to take time off work, and at first it made sense. I wanted to be there for those precious early months, but a few months turned into a year, then 2 years, then 5. Every time I mentioned going back to architecture, Richard would say, "Why? We don't need the money. Dylan needs you. I need you to manage the house, handle the social obligations. You're so good at all of that." So I stayed. I became the perfect wife for an ambitious businessman. I hosted dinner parties for his clients. I managed our household like a CEO. I made sure his life ran smoothly so he could focus on building his empire. And I was a mother to Dylan. That part I never regretted, not for a single second. But somewhere along the way, I stopped being Sarah, the architect with dreams of designing sustainable buildings. I became Sarah Mitchell, Richard's wife, Richard's hostess, Richard's accessory. By year 10, I barely recognized myself. I'd look in the mirror and see this polished, put-together woman in designer clothes, and I'd wonder where the girl with charcoal-stained fingers and big dreams had gone. The first real crack appeared on our 12th anniversary. Richard came home late, which wasn't unusual anymore. His business had exploded over the years. Mitchell Development Group was now one of the biggest players in Chicago commercial real estate. He was flying to New York, Los Angeles, Miami, closing deals worth millions. I was proud of him, honestly. I told myself that his absence was the price of success, that this was what I'd signed up for. But that night, our anniversary, he'd promised to be home by 7. We had reservations at the restaurant where he'd proposed. I'd bought a new dress. Dylan was at my mom's. I'd planned everything. 7 o'clock came and went. Then 8, then 9. I called his cell 6 times, straight to voicemail. I finally ate the anniversary cake I'd ordered by myself, still in that stupid dress, mascara running down my face. He stumbled in at midnight, reeking of scotch and making some excuse about a client meeting that ran late. I didn't believe him, but I also didn't have the energy to fight. So I did what I'd learned to do. I swallowed my disappointment, cleaned up the cake, and went to bed.
That became the pattern. Broken promises, late nights, increasing distance. Richard was always on his phone, always distracted, always somewhere else, even when he was sitting right next to me. We stopped having real conversations. We stopped laughing together. We stopped being us. The intimate side of our marriage had basically died about 3 years earlier. At first, Richard blamed stress. Then he blamed exhaustion. Eventually, he just stopped pretending to care. We were roommates, sharing a mansion, nothing more. But I stayed. You want to know why? Because of Dylan, my sweet, sensitive 10-year-old boy who still thought his father hung the moon, who lit up every time Richard actually made it home for dinner, who kept asking, "When's Dad coming to my soccer game? When's Dad going to help me with my science project?" I couldn't break Dylan's heart, so I lived in this beautiful prison, playing the role of the happy wife while dying a little more inside every day. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Tuesday in March, about 6 months before Richard asked for the divorce. I remember because Dylan had just turned 10 the week before, and Richard had missed his birthday party. Again, some emergency in Miami that couldn't wait. I was in Richard's home office looking for our insurance documents. Dylan had fallen off his bike, and I needed to check something about our coverage. Richard's office was usually off-limits, his sanctuary, he called it, but he was out of town and I needed those papers. I found the insurance folder easily enough, but as I was putting it back in the filing cabinet, my hand knocked against something taped to the back of the drawer. Instinct told me to leave it alone. Curiosity made me reach for it. It was a USB drive, a small black one, carefully hidden behind the drawer itself. Now, I'm not proud of what I did next. I should have just put it back, but something in my gut told me that drive was hidden for a reason, and after 12 years of feeling like I was slowly disappearing, I needed to know the truth. I plugged it into his computer. My hands were shaking. What I found made my blood run cold. Files. Dozens of them. Spreadsheets, emails, scanned documents. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. But I have a degree in architecture. I'm good with numbers, good with details. And as I started reading, really reading, the pieces came together. Richard wasn't just running a successful real estate development company. He was running a house of cards built on fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The Mitchell Development Group that looked so legitimate on paper was a shell game involving offshore accounts, dummy corporations, and falsified financial statements. There were emails to his accountant about creative bookkeeping, documents showing property valuations that were clearly inflated to secure bigger loans, contracts with shell companies that all traced back to accounts Richard controlled, evidence of bribing city officials for zoning changes, and most damning of all, years of tax returns that bore no resemblance to his actual income. I sat there in his office until 3 in the morning, going through every single file. I copied everything to my own drive and put his back exactly where I'd found it. Then I sat in the dark and tried to process what I'd just learned. My husband was a criminal, not just cutting corners or being aggressive with deductions. He was committing serious federal crimes, the kind that came with prison sentences, the kind that could destroy everything he'd built. And suddenly, I realized something else. Everything we owned, the house, the cars, the vacation property in Lake Geneva, the investment accounts, all of it was purchased with money from his fraudulent business. All of it could be seized by the government. All of it was tainted. I should have been devastated. I should have been scared. But you know what I felt? Power. For the first time in years, I felt powerful because I knew something Richard didn't know I knew, and information I was learning was the most valuable currency of all. That weekend, while Dylan was still at his friend's house, I called a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. I called Margaret Chen, the toughest divorce attorney in Chicago, the one you hired when you wanted to burn your ex's life to the ground. Margaret had a corner office overlooking the Chicago River and a reputation for making powerful men cry. I sat across from her that Monday morning and told her everything. About Richard's request for a divorce, about the hidden USB drive, about what I'd discovered. Margaret's eyes got wider and wider as I talked. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and let out a long breath. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "do you understand what you have here? This is evidence of major financial crimes. Tax evasion alone could put your husband away for years. Add in the fraud, the money laundering, we're talking about federal charges." "I know," I said. "If you give this to the authorities, your husband will go to prison. Everything he owns will be seized by the government. You and your son could lose everything." "I know," I said again. "But," Margaret continued, leaning forward, "if we play this right, we can use this information to negotiate. We can make him give you everything you want: custody, child support, spousal support, property. We have all the leverage." I shook my head. "That's not what I want." Margaret looked confused. "Then what do you want?" And that's when I told her my plan. She thought I was insane. She spent an hour trying to talk me out of it, but I was adamant. This was the only way. "I want you to negotiate the worst divorce settlement in history," I said. "I want you to make it look like you're barely trying. Let Richard's lawyer run circles around you. I'll agree to everything he wants. He gets the house, the business, all the properties, the investment accounts, everything, except custody of Dylan. I want full custody, and I want child support. A reasonable amount, not too much, and modest spousal support. Something that looks fair but doesn't raise any red flags." "Sarah, this is financial suicide," Margaret said. "You'll walk away with almost nothing while he gets everything." "Exactly," I said. "I want him to think he's won. I want him to feel victorious. I want him so confident and so convinced of his own cleverness that he doesn't look too closely at what he's actually getting." Margaret stared at me for a long moment. Then, slowly, understanding dawned on her face. "Oh my God, you're brilliant. You evil, brilliant woman." She was right on both counts. Over the next few months, we played our roles perfectly. Margaret negotiated like she was terrible at her job. She'd make half-hearted demands that Richard's lawyer would immediately shut down. She'd reluctantly agreed to giving Richard asset after asset. She even pretended to try to talk me into fighting harder while making sure Richard's team overheard. Meanwhile, I played the defeated wife. I cried at the right moments. I looked exhausted and beaten down. My friends and family all tried to talk sense into me. "Sarah, don't do this," my mother pleaded. "He's taking advantage of you. Fight back." But I just shook my head sadly and said I was tired of fighting. I just wanted it to be over. I wanted to focus on Dylan. Richard, meanwhile, was thriving. He seemed lighter, happier. I'm sure his girlfriend, because of course there was a girlfriend, a 28-year-old marketing associate from his company named Brittany, I'm sure she was making him very happy. He started being almost nice to me again, probably out of guilt or relief that I wasn't making things difficult. His lawyer kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for us to suddenly demand something, but it never came. I signed every paper they put in front of me. Every time Margaret begged me to reconsider, I refused. The day before the final hearing, Margaret and I met one last time. "You're absolutely sure about this?" she asked. I looked at the settlement papers. Richard would get the house in Evanston worth $2.3 million, the vacation home in Lake Geneva, $850,000, his business and all associated assets, $47 million on paper, all investment accounts, $3.2 million, both cars, a Mercedes and a BMW, and every other asset accumulated during the marriage. I would get full custody of Dylan, $4,000 a month in child support, $6,000 a month in spousal support for 5 years, and whatever was in my personal checking account, about $12,000. On paper, it looked like the most lopsided divorce settlement ever. I was giving up tens of millions of dollars. "I'm sure," I said. "Do you know what I think will happen?" Margaret asked. "Tell me." "I think in about 6 months, maybe a year, the IRS is going to start asking questions about Mitchell Development Group. They're going to do an audit, and they're going to find exactly what you found on that USB drive. And when they do, they're going to seize every asset connected to the fraud. The house, the business, the investment accounts, all of it. Your ex-husband is going to lose everything and probably go to prison. And you, she smiled, be sitting pretty with your son, collecting spousal and child support that will become a court-ordered debt he can never escape, even from prison. You'll be the victim of his crimes, not a beneficiary. You'll have nothing that can be taken from you. That's exactly right.
The courtroom was small, which I hadn't expected. I'd imagined something grand and dramatic, but it was just a regular Tuesday afternoon in a windowless room with fluorescent lights. Richard was already there with his lawyer, Frank Jacobson, one of those silver-haired men who'd spent their career helping rich people stay rich. Richard was wearing his best suit, the Armani one he saved for important meetings. He looked confident, almost smug. My mother was sitting in the gallery, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. My best friend Rachel had her arm around her. They both looked at me like I was making the biggest mistake of my life. Maybe I was. Or maybe I was making the smartest move I'd ever made. Judge Patricia Hendricks entered, and we all stood. She was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. I'd learned she'd handled thousands of divorce cases and had zero patience for drama. "Let's keep this brief," she said, settling into her chair. "I've reviewed the settlement agreement. This is highly unusual. Mrs. Mitchell, you're aware you're entitled to far more than what you're accepting." "Yes, Your Honor," I said. My voice was steady, calm. "I just want this to be over. I want to focus on my son." The judge looked skeptical but nodded. "Mr. Jacobson, your client is satisfied with these terms?" Frank stood. "Yes, Your Honor, my client believes this is a fair and equitable division of assets." I had to suppress a smile. Fair and equitable, sure. "Mrs. Mitchell's attorney, do you have anything to add?" Margaret stood. She'd played her role perfectly over these months, but now, for just a moment, I saw a flash of the shark she really was. "My client has made her decision, Your Honor. While I've advised her to reconsider, she's determined to proceed." "Very well," Judge Hendricks said. She slid the papers across her desk. "Mrs. Mitchell, if you'll sign here and initial here." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I'd practiced this moment in my mind 1,000 times. I signed my name, Sarah J. Mitchell. Then again and again, each signature transferring away millions of dollars of assets. Richard was watching me with barely concealed satisfaction. He probably thought I was an idiot, a naive, broken woman who didn't know any better. When I finished, Judge Hendricks collected the papers. "Mr. Mitchell, your signatures." Richard practically bounded to the desk. He signed quickly, eagerly, each signature securing another piece of his victory. When he finished, he actually smiled at me. Not a kind smile, a pitying one, like he felt sorry for how badly I'd just lost. "All right," Judge Hendricks said, stamping the final document. "This divorce is finalized. You're both free to go." Richard immediately stood and shook Frank's hand. "Thank you," I heard him say. "Thank you for everything." Frank smiled, but something in his expression seemed off. He was looking at the papers we'd just signed with this slight frown, like something was bothering him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As we filed out of the courtroom, Richard actually approached me. "Sarah," he said, his voice almost gentle, "I hope you know I never wanted to hurt you. This is really for the best, for both of us." I looked at him, this man I'd spent 15 years of my life with, this man I loved once, this man who'd slowly poisoned everything good between us, and I smiled. "You're right, Richard. This is for the best, for both of us." He looked surprised by my agreement, probably expected me to be angry or bitter. Instead, I just turned and walked out of that courthouse with my head held high. As I pushed through the doors into the June sunshine, I heard something that made me pause. Frank Jacobson's voice, sharp and urgent. "Richard, wait, we need to talk about something." But I didn't stay to listen. I had somewhere to be. 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was sitting in my new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a good school district, helping Dylan with his homework when my phone rang. It was Margaret. "Turn on the news," she said. "Channel 7. I grabbed the remote. The local news was showing footage of federal agents walking out of the Mitchell Development Group offices with boxes. Lots of boxes. "Federal investigators raided the offices of Mitchell Development Group this morning," the news anchor was saying. "The company's CEO, Richard Mitchell, is under investigation for alleged fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. Sources say the investigation has been ongoing for several months." several months. It had actually been nearly a year, because the day after I discovered that USB drive, before I'd even decided what to do about my marriage, I'd done one more thing. I'd made an anonymous call to the IRS tip line. I'd sent copies of those files to a federal prosecutor. I'd set wheels in motion that couldn't be stopped. I'd just never told Richard. Or anyone. "Mom?" Dylan looked up from his math worksheet. "Isn't that Dad's office?" "Yeah, honey," I said, turning off the TV. Dad has some problems at work. It's going to be okay, though." Over the next few weeks, the story exploded. The investigation revealed everything I'd found and more. Richard had been running his fraud for nearly a decade. The estimated amount he'd evaded in taxes alone was over $8 million. The properties he'd purchased with fraudulent loans were worth nearly $50 million. He'd bribed city officials, falsified documents, and created an elaborate shell game to hide his crimes. Every asset in his name was frozen, then seized. The house, his house now, the one he'd fought so hard to keep, was padlocked by federal agents. The Lake Geneva property? Seized. The business? Dissolved. The investment accounts? Frozen and then emptied to pay restitution. Richard was arrested on a Tuesday morning. I saw the footage of him doing the perp walk, hands cuffed behind his back, his expensive suit rumpled, his face stunned and disbelieving. Frank Jacobson held a press conference where he looked absolutely shattered. He hadn't known. None of Richard's lawyers had known. They'd all been fooled by the facade of success. But here's the beautiful thing. I hadn't been named in any of it, because I'd given it all back before the hammer fell. I owned nothing connected to his crimes. I'd been divorced from him for months when the investigation became public. I was legally and financially separate from his disaster. I was a victim of his deception, just like everyone else, a naive wife who'd been kept in the dark about her husband's criminal enterprise. My modest spousal and child support payments, those became a court-ordered debt that survived even his bankruptcy. The court ruled that Richard owed me that money personally. It wasn't connected to his business assets. So even though he lost everything else, he was still legally obligated to pay me $10,000 a month from prison, where he'd be for the next 12 years. The prosecutors even felt sorry for me. One of them called to apologize for what I'd been through married to a criminal without knowing it. I accepted their condolences gracefully. A few days after Richard's arrest, I got a letter. It was from him, written from the county jail where he was being held without bail. "Sarah," it said, "I don't understand what happened. Everything fell apart so fast. I lost everything. I wish I'd never asked for that divorce. I wish I'd appreciated what I had when I had it. You tried to tell me that some things were more important than money and success. I should have listened. I'm sorry for everything. Please tell Dylan I love him." I read that letter 3 times, then I put it in a drawer. Here's what Richard never understood. I didn't want revenge. I wanted freedom. Freedom from his crimes, from his lies, from his world built on fraud. When he asked for that divorce and demanded all those assets, he handed me exactly what I needed, a way out that looked like I'd lost. Everyone thought I was the victim, the poor wife who got screwed in the divorce. Even my own mother spent months feeling sorry for me, telling me I should have fought harder. But I knew the truth. Richard had taken everything, just like he wanted, and in doing so, he'd set himself up for the greatest fall of his life. That was 18 months ago. Dylan and I are doing well. He struggled at first, learning what his father had done, watching kids at school whisper about him, but he's resilient. Like his mother. We talk about it openly. I never let him think his father's choices were his fault. I went back to school, got my architecture license renewed, took some courses on sustainable design. Last month, I got hired by a firm that specializes in affordable housing projects. The pay isn't glamorous, but I woke up excited about work for the first time in over a decade. I'm designing again, creating things, building a life that's mine. Richard writes letters sometimes. They're full of regrets and what-ifs. I let Dylan read them if he wants to. That's his father, his relationship to navigate. But I don't write back. People ask me sometimes if I knew, if I somehow predicted that Richard would get caught. I always smile and say no, that I just wanted the divorce to be over quickly for Dylan's sake, that I got lucky. But between you and me, I didn't get lucky. I got smart.
When Richard took everything in that divorce, he thought he was taking all the valuable things, the money, the properties, the assets. What he didn't realize was that he was taking all the evidence of his crimes. He was taking all the liability, all the exposure. And me? I took the only thing that ever really mattered anyway, my son, my freedom, and a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to fight for everything. Sometimes it's knowing exactly what to let go. Richard wanted it all, and I gave him exactly what he asked for. He just had no idea what he was really taking.